Right, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to the latest TBI lunchtime seminar. Delighted to welcome Thiemo Fetzer, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick. Now Thiemo, some of you may have seen some of his work. He's perhaps best known for a fascinating paper he did looking at the impact of public spending cuts in the UK on populism and support, particularly for UKIP and for the Brexit vote, which has gone sort of viral, as it were, and got a lot of interest. But today we're going to be hearing from him about his latest paper, which is written with co-authors Sringe Sen and Pedro Sousa, and it's on housing insecurity, homelessness and populism. So it's looking specifically at changes in housing policy and specifically housing benefit over the past decade, because there's been some quite radical cuts there that have had pretty far-reaching effects. So we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Now, Thiemo is going to speak to us for about half an hour-ish. And if you have questions as we go, then feel free to ask them, and then we'll get into a more open-ended discussion after that. So Thiemo, welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is, at some level, it's a first because it's literally the first time this is papers presented, so it's pretty fresh. And obviously it's still work in progress. At some level, you can think about this as a continuation of the work on austerity, because it looks at a very specific type of reform, tackling an issue that is rising in many Western democracies because of, you know, at the end of the day, it's a consequence of the fallout from the financial crisis, lower interest rates and whatnot, and sort of the flight into safe assets and whatnot, and that has implications. It's particularly pronounced in the UK because the UK, for decades now, has failed to tackle its sort of endemic problem in the housing market. There's an economic rationale why a government or a finance ministry wants to tackle this type of benefit that I'm studying, the housing benefit, because it creates this huge upside risks to government spending, but at the same time it can produce significant negative economic consequences, and this is something that I want to shed some light on in this paper. There is a chair that I'm happy to borrow. Okay. Perfect. So, I mean, just on the way here, this is a picture that, I mean, you will see more and more across the UK, but again, if you've recently visited Brussels, it's quite shocking. The number of people who are sleeping rough or living on the street. This is kind of the most extreme outcome of a failure. But at some level, what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that at some level it's a political choice. And it can be sort of driven by, social policy choices. At some level, this puts it into a different perspective. It's not a natural consequence of things. My partner lives in Copenhagen, and you hardly ever see anybody homeless in Copenhagen. So obviously, they're doing stuff differently than UK authorities or in Brussels authorities are doing. One of the motivations to start this project was actually to look at homelessness. It's a very it doesn't affect hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, but it's extremely visible. And in that sense, it can distort people's perceptions of an underlying policy failure. In the UK, roughly 1/3 of rough sleepers are EU nationals, many of them from Eastern Europe, and that itself can have an impact on the perceptions of a social problem, perception of the extent of migration, because obviously a lot of these Eastern European homeless people wouldn't have been there 10, 15 years ago. And that itself might change the way that voters perceive a social policy problem. That was at the end of the day the motivation to start working on this, to trying to link kind of the visibility of local decline. I have some other work on kind of the retail sector decline in urban centers in the UK, which is much more advanced than in other parts of Europe for various reasons. A lot of it again has to do with the housing market. So over time in the UK, as we see, this is just plotting the number of rough sleepers. This data is not particularly good. I was on a call with the ministry just before Christmas, Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government. This is counting the number of rough sleepers. It's usually done as a spot count at in the third quarter of the year. It's not very reliable on the levels, but it's reliable in terms of the dynamics. And this kind of tells a clear picture that it's been trending up. There's this very steep acceleration in recent years. This data can now be extended to 2018, where 2018 was the first time where there was not a year-on-year increase for the past decade. So, but it clearly suggests that dynamically something has been happening in terms of rough sleeping. And this is another metric that just measures across districts the share of people or households that are housed in temporary accommodation by their local council. So this is literally, if it says 2.5, it means 2.5% of households in a district, on average, across the UK, in 2009 were living in temporary accommodation. This is temporary accommodation that is provided for by local councils because they have a statutory obligation to prevent homelessness, in particular for cases with priority needs. So this is working families with children. And disabled people. That's the typical archetype. Again, here we see a continuous increase over time, which suggests that again, this is obviously something that has become much more pronounced and prevalent across the UK. And again, this is normalizing by the fact that on average, most of the UK has seen population growth, and actually more households, because households on average get smaller. So actually the denominator is growing at the same time, but since the ratio is growing, it means the numerator is growing much faster than the denominator. So what I do in the paper is looking at a very specific type of reform. That's something that actually many people have overlooked. It was a big deal in 2011, and it kind of now established a new norm. The UK has a system to provide assistance for low-income households to pay for rental accommodation that used to be quite separated or segregated between people on low incomes living in the social rented sector, local authority rent and whatnot, vis-a-vis people living in the private rented sector. There's been some attempt to try to converge these two systems so that there's no kind of discrimination essentially between tenants in the private rented sector vis-a-vis the social rented sector. They have not been particularly successful. One of the reforms I look in the austerity paper that tried to harmonize the housing benefits with kind of the housing benefits available to social rented tenants was the bedroom tax, which you might have known, which kind of just leveled the set of rules in terms of eligibility for number of bedrooms. Housing benefit in 2018 cost the UK government about £23 billion. It's making up about 11% of all welfare spending, so it's a huge ticket item when it comes to welfare spending. And it's one that, if you look at it over time, has massively grown, and it's directly linked to the underlying evolution of rents. And that is because up to March 2011, the way that the eligibility for housing benefit, the amount that you would claim, the way it was computed was looking at a sample of rents that were collected by the valuation office agency, which is kind of estimating these things. It's looking at a sample of rents or rental contracts that are submitted to it voluntarily by the private rented sector, by landlords and so on, and then estimate for what it's called broad rental market areas. There's about 152 broad rental market areas across the UK. It's estimating what is the median rent, the average rent, the 30th percentile, the 10th percentile, the 90th percentile. So it's estimating various moments of what the rents are. And it used to be that the maximum amount that one is eligible in terms of housing benefit support should be as high as the median rent in a broad rental market area. That was from 2008 to 2011. And then from April 2011, this was significantly cut to only cover the 30th percentile. Subsequently, there was more reforms that I'll just mention, but this was a huge one because it was basically a one-off large cut that affected a huge stock of existing tenants. In total, it's estimated there was about 700,000 to 1 million households that are affected by this, and they're actually making up a huge part of the private rented sector, namely between 17.5 to 25% of the private rented sector tenants. So it basically affected almost £1/4 of all the private rented sector tenants. The average cut was £470 per affected household across the UK. This is ignoring local kind of conditions. In most of London, it was in excess of £2,000, and there it was exacerbated by further cuts like the benefit cap and whatnot. So this is probably a lower bound. That causes some problems for the causal identification, but I think we've kind of got it nailed down reasonably well. So how are we trying to say that this policy caused an effect on, for example, temporary accommodation, rough sleeping, and so on and so forth? How are we trying to do this? The idea is actually very simple. We exploit something like very basic statistics. the way that the valuation office agency goes on about, used to go on about until April 2012, was to estimate every month the median market rent for 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, shared rate, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, and there used to be a 5 bedrooms, but the 5 bedroom part was also cut, so it was cut. They would estimate for 152 broad rental market areas across 5 property types every month the median. They have about 500,000 data points at their disposal, which means they have about, this works out to be roughly 10,000 empirical moments. They have about 50 observations per moment, and these 50 observations are not uniformly distributed across the UK. London has a much bigger rental sector than other parts of the UK, right? So it means that these estimates are estimated with noise, which means there's a true part, but then there's a part of the median or the 30th percentile that is just capturing the fact that this month was a weird sample. We're trying to I've been trying to FOIA data from them to actually allow us to give us the whole distribution of rents that they use to actually estimate these at each point in time. Let's see. They're supposed to reply by today, actually. So I'm reasonably curious. What they did provide prior to the reform being implemented, they provided us both the 50th percentile, which in 2010 in June was the maximum local housing allowance that was provided. They also computed the 30th percentile that would have emerged. So we kind of see the counterfactual 30th percentile that would have existed in June 2010 prior to the reform, had the reform been implemented at that point in time already. So, and that allows us to learn a little bit about the amount of statistical noise that is in that data, because we have this data at multiple time points. So this is the nutshell in terms of the identification strategy. What do we find? We haven't optimized in the sense of how we explain this kind of the magnitudes and the findings, so maybe this seems a bit off. But what economists tend to do is they kind of normalize stuff into, so that units become standard deviations, but then stuff becomes very meaningless, because what is a standard deviation? It's funny, at some point I tweeted something about a 1 standard deviation increase of this. Caused this and this, and then there was a retweet. It's oh, 1 standard deviation is large, but how large 1 standard deviation is, that really depends on, the actual data, right? It just makes stuff usually comparable. A 1 standard deviation increase works out to be around £600 in terms of a cut. So 1 standard deviation higher cut per household in terms of housing benefit due to the shift from the 50th percentile to the 30th percentile, it's about £600. That's not negligible if you're realizing that the average, I think the median disposable household income is about £24,000. So that's easily 3%. What does a 1 standard deviation shock do? It increases forced evictions only in the private rented sector, not in the social rented sector, because the social rented sector was not affected by this cut. It increases insolvencies and bankruptcy by about 2.6%. So a £600 increases insolvencies, bankruptcy by 2.6%. This is relative to the pre-reform period. We see a temporary rise in property crimes, mostly thefts, not burglaries. This is kind of the social, how is it affecting the local housing market? Now, how does it affect governments? How does it affect local councils? As I indicated, local councils have a statutory obligation to house people who are priority households who are at risk of homelessness. As a result of a 1 standard deviation shock, a £600 per household per year, the demand for temporary accommodation rises pretty much almost the same amount, in proportionate terms as the eviction increases. The cost increase to local councils is bizarre. It's close to 100%. Because what do the councils now have to do? They have to go into the property market to rent at market rates houses or real estate from private landlords in order to meet their legal obligation to house homeless people. And obviously, they're not doing this in a very planned way. They're doing it in a reactive way to this, growing crisis. And as such, they're facing pretty bad prices. And that's coupled by the fact that this reform also eroded the market that's available to people on low incomes. For quite some time, you would have seen, I mean, I lived in London, Guildford, Coventry, like you would see quite a bit when you look on tenancy websites, it's like no children, no pets, no DSS, which, like in Germany, this would be a no-go. Like it would, I mean, I think now it's outlawed here as well, at least the DSS part. But it basically means that people have been shut out from the social rented sector. There's estimates that only about 20% of landlords in the UK still are willing to lend to rent to social security benefit claimants. That broadens and narrows the market dramatically. And I think the situation for councils that are trying to house people, of that predicament, is pretty much very slim as well. And that explains why, because the market is so segmented, the cost increase are just crazy. And so the other outcomes that we document is statutory homelessness. This is when a council decides it owes a duty to a household to house it because of a risk of being homeless. Most people that are being assessed whether there's a statutory duty owed by the council are previously housed in temporary accommodation, prior to the decision being made. So this is why it's, slightly smaller. So there's some churn here where some people kind of like move out and whatnot. And this is something that we'll hope to tackle. We also see a dramatic increase in rough sleeping, but the issue is here that the base is very unreliable. As I said, the level is unreliable to work with. The dynamics we can work with, but obviously whether this is 36% or 20%, it's hard to make a case. Partly because the data is problematic. There's gamification and whatnot on the day. I mean, I used to volunteer in a winter night shelter in Camden, and doing a street count in November. This is when shelters operate, and this is when most homeless people are actually not sleeping rough. They're actually, taken care of by, what was meant to be the big society. The third set of outcomes that we're looking at, and this is something that I think is particularly important because it matters, in a profound way for the legitimacy, is that what we document is that it seems to erode, this housing benefit can seems to have eroded democratic participation at the very extensive level in a way that's kind of reminding us of what's going on in the US with kind of systematic voter suppression, whereby we see that people voluntarily drop out. So the share of residents in a district divided by the voting age population in that district is going down systematically more in places that are more exposed by this cut. And we can basically rule out that this is driven by immigration. We can look at the broadest measure of the electorate, which is the local electorate, which at least up to January 31st basically includes most migrants that are resident in the UK. It includes all Commonwealth migrants, all EU migrants. We see that there's a significant decline. In the case of the EU referendum, that amounts to a significantly lower electorate. So in a place that is hit by a 1 standard deviation higher shock, the electorate has shrunk. It's systematically smaller compared to a district that has been exposed to a less significant, less sizable shock. Turnout in the EU referendum is systematically lower, and the leave vote is systematically higher. I don't think this is about capturing anything about the preference of the voters who end up turning out. It's just capturing the fact that the composition of those who participate in the democratic process has changed in a way that kind of skewed the results away from the Remain side. This is actually something, if you look at turnout in urban agglomeration, I mean, it was not as high. It was particularly lower there's a gradient whereby an austerity hit town vis-a-vis an austerity hit urban agglomeration. Turnout in similar kind of exposed area, if it was a town, turnout was lower. So that's something I think that is not just specific to this type of housing benefit. Now, coming to the fiscal savings side, obviously this was a reform that was intended to save the Department for Works and Pensions, or at the end of the day, the grand scheme of things, the government money. We estimate how much money they saved, the Department for Works and Pensions saved. It's not peanuts; it's quite a bit of money. But the perverse side, local councils, had to step up. And they had to step up in a very inefficient way, providing housing. They couldn't plan for this, they didn't plan for this, and they had to respond in a very inefficient way, which kind of led to this massively inflated costs for temporary accommodation. So at the median, so this is the median district, for every pound saved, council spending went up on housing homeless people, went up by 76 pence. So for every pound fiscally consolidated across tiers of government, only 25 cents were saved at the median council. The average, it looks slightly better, partly because obviously the effect is much stronger in urban agglomeration than in sort of more rural parts. But that means fiscally this is, it was a false economy, as some people would call this. It's a very narrow policy that also at some level I think is very problematic for other reasons. At some level, what I hope to be doing is to look specifically at London, partly because this is a very interesting kind of case. If you look at the data on housing benefit claimants in London, there has been a decline, but the decline has not been sort of much broader. A lot of this decline can simply be accounted for by the improving economy post 2015, roughly. Post the shock to the austerity kind of that caused the second dip after the financial crisis. So a lot of this can be. So in London, what we see there is that housing benefit claimants, on average, they're much more likely now to be in work, but still, in need for housing benefit in order to pay for rent. And they're moving to places that are further away, more marginal, that are less connected, that have less access to public goods. So in particular, less access to transport, which means you're actually superimposing the cost of commuting onto that kind of, public. And if there's one thing that I learned from the UK is commuting from Guildford to London is really, really painful. And it kind of drains resources, it drains time, it drains energy. There's a big question about why this country has such an abysmal record in growing productively, growing the amount that is produced with the same set of inputs. They've been good at growing people, like more, adding more factors of production, but the average factor of production is not becoming more productive. And that's the source of sustainable wealth. And this is a big, big puzzle. And I think some of these reforms, when you kind of impose and privatize the social cost of this commuting and so on and so forth, this has a productivity tax. Just like the way that how home construction is done in this country also imposes a productivity tax, because most of the new developments, like every morning, and this is particularly visible in around Coventry, all the new developments, there's a traffic jam in the morning getting out, and there's a traffic jam in the morning in the evening getting in. So people are now spending time in their cars while they try to get to work. This is, first of all, lifetime lost, but it's also potentially productive lifetime lost. And a lot of this is down to the fact that developers have no incentives to waste an inch of space on sort of developable land space on making a development sensibly accessible in terms of transport. That's also something I think that should be studied, partly born by my experience. I mean, I see the difference from how this is done in my hometown in Germany. In Germany, it's basically done completely different. But all the rents in my hometown for the value, that the appreciation of land that is generated by declaring a land from agricultural use to residential use, all that value is absorbed by the city, and the city uses this value to prepare the plots, to lay out the infrastructure, and then sell the plots to individuals who then build their homes. So it's a completely different system, whereas here it's the rent taking that takes place at the stage. All of these rents are at the end of the day private, and a lot of them are not taxed. So there's huge, this is basically the paper in a nutshell. I can now go into kind of layers and do it a slightly more technical, or rush through, I'm pretty sure there's a huge, why does this matter? Insecurity is important in affecting life outcomes. We know it affects health, we know it affects educational attainment. It creates problems for the next generation if you don't have secure housing. There's a huge literature on the adverse effects. most of it coming from the US. I lived in Chicago for some time, and this is, it's brutal and visible on a day-to-day basis in a way that seems to be becoming more visible, not just in the UK, but in other parts of Europe as well. It kind of puts into perspective the role that the state could or should play in providing housing or providing housing amenities. And obviously there's some work that people have done on the topic on sort of welfare cuts more broadly. So you probably are all familiar. I'm very happy to just close it here, or it depends a little bit on you can tell me what you want to see and I can show it to you.
Up to you, really. I mean, you could
flick,
this and
yeah.
perhaps skip the maths.
Yeah, perfect. I'm perfectly happy with this. What's remarkable in this picture is the evolution of what's been happening in terms of the growing use of the private rented sector, the social rented sector. In terms of, this is the share of households in the UK across the whole of the UK. What is their kind of tendency? We see that kind of owner occupation has basically flatlined. Social rented occupation has basically flatlined. New owner, potential future owner occupation has massively declined. This is obviously massive in terms of the scales. This is about 10 percentage point. That's huge within just 10 years. And the private rented sector has expanded. So this is a puzzle because it happens in the context of us living in a time when real interest rates are zero. When basically the cost of borrowing is zero. So the fact that we see not a surge in people kind of accessing the housing market suggests that there's an endemic failure, that has a root elsewhere. A lot of that slack is absorbed by the private rented sector, and the UK's private rented sector is not. There's no protection, as a tenant, and that's a social policy problem as well. And here it's exacerbated by a political problem, because a lot of the private renters tend to be young. And the young tend to move around. They're much less likely to be on the electoral roll. They're much less likely to engage. Democratic participation is a good that's income elastic. And I think this is the part where, if people have insecure incomes, they're much less likely to democratically participate. And this burden is borne by the future generation, and to some extent, disproportionately also by the immigrant population in this country, because they're much more likely to be in the private rented sector. So housing benefit aims to kind of level the housing cost. It aims to kind of take the sting out of the cost of accommodation. And it does so quite differentially. For mortgage, there's some kind of relief that is provided for people who are struggling to pay their mortgage, but are kind of structurally solid, have structurally solid finance. It doesn't kind of change the share pre-post this type of housing benefits available to mortgage people who pay down a mortgage. The cost of housing as a share of disposable income is about 18.2%. In the private rented sector, this is on average across the whole of the UK. The cost of private rented accommodation is about 34% of income when we include housing benefit. And if we exclude it, it's about 39%. So housing benefit takes out about 5%. This is as of 2018 or 2017, so it's post-reform. The social rented sector, the equivalent of housing benefit, takes out a much bigger part of the housing cost, which means being it's closer to closer to 8-9%. And so it takes out roughly almost twice as much of the kind of sting to a much more sustainable level. Across the UK, roughly 30% of the population spend 41% of their disposable income on housing. The lowest decile spends about 64%. Like in Germany, this would never happen. People are freaking out by, square meter rents of about 10 euros. In the UK, it's, I don't know, the standard is more closely like 20 pounds or something like this. It's just crazy. And we know that, the life, I don't know. Like, this is something that, when I go to Germany and I see my sisters, they're complaining about rent, it's like, I would say it's geschenkt, it's basically for free. it's much more regulated as well. My dad has some, owns some property with his brothers. They used to be farmers. You can't just raise the rent. The city has a guiding rents as to what you can charge. And a tenant can contest if you go above. And it's pretty complicated kind of set of rules. But raising rents is something that is actually quite rare. Last year was this year is the first time, 2019, when I renewed my tenancy, it's the first time that I lived in the UK that my rent did not go up. But this is in Coventry, and like not the part very close to the train stations. So the reform, as I said, that we look at, and this is kind of roughly what happens. There's a lot of more things that are going on when it comes to housing benefit. This is roughly the picture as to what happens. This is the local housing allowance. And this is the 30th percentile. The cut to local housing allowance was implemented right around here. So this is where roughly the 30th percentile coincides with the local housing allowance. At that point in time, the relevant percentile was the median. So the cut that we study is basically the shock. But you have to see this in context of the private rental market evolution, whereby the 30th percentile of rents between 2010 to 2013, this is inner North London, broad rental market area, has gone up by about £50 or roughly 20% in the time span of just 3-4 years. So this is obviously compounding a lot of the impact of this shock. This is why in the empirical analysis we kind of take out the time period when they formally shifted from the 30th percentile. They did a lot, I think, very fishy, around the way that the 30th percentile is computed. That's why I'm very curious to get the microdata. Because, it's obvious that, and then obviously subsequently there was changing from the uprating. There was basically, a complete disconnect from local rental markets. Where now housing benefit is not uprated anymore. It used to be was frozen, and it's basically disconnected from local rental markets, which means like this gap is now huge, which means local housing allowance across the UK it now only covers about the 10th percentile of rents, which means only 10% of the available properties are affordable with local housing allowance, which means it's a very specific type of property, I'm pretty sure. In terms of the quality side. Just how, maybe I'll just show some maps how this looks. This is the incidence of the cut in terms of like for 2-bedroom flats. So the dark red ones, these are local authority districts. So you see that it's more dark red around urban agglomeration, which have the most dynamic housing markets. And you see that sort of like this is the kind of upper quintile. The loss was about between 11 to 58 pounds per week for 2-bedroom flats. It was between 15 to 91 pounds per week for 3-bedroom flats. There's quite a bit of variation. For some places we don't have data. The share of households that were affected, the share of resident households that were affected, in some parts of London, up to the top bracket was about 23% of all households living in a district were affected by this cut. So that's huge. I mean, this is 1/4 of the population that lives in of the houses living in a district. And as we look at, again, for London, we see that the average is about 400. But if we look at sort of London, and some other urban agglomerations, the cut was up to £2,400 per year. In the empirical analysis, we showed that all the results are robust to dropping London, because you can always find, Cambridge and Oxford is just as bad at some level, when it comes to the delta, to the amount that was lost. And these are the slides that probably look ugly because they've been, that's where the cock happens. But at the end of the day, this is just showing kind of the idea that, we're looking at these empirical estimates of these median and the 30th percentile. And these are estimated with noise. So part of the policy shock reflects the statistical noise that's due to the sampling variation, which means we can try to parse out all the systematic part and focus on the amount of the policy variation that's due to this idiosyncratic sampling noise. And we know that if you if you have some basic statistics, you know that the variance of a difference is the variance of the sum plus the covariances. So it tends to inflate. So the difference here, which is basically what the policy shock is, the variance here goes up, and we have huge amount of variation. So we can zoom into districts that had the same exposure of the shock, not by virtue of having similar rental markets, but simply by having the same amount of statistical noise, so to say. And this allows us to kind of quite compellingly claim that we identify a causal effect. Yeah, this is technical part, this is technical part, this is more technical part. This is a set of graphs around what happens to over time systematically. So the way to read this is that this is the line over time for the average district after having taken out district-specific kind of fixed characteristics like location. The level of rent in London will always be higher than the level of rent in Coventry, but maybe the dynamic in relative terms is similar. In some parts around Coventry actually has a booming housing market, usually near universities. But what this is saying is that after having taken this into account, and for nation or country-specific nonlinear time trends, because some year might be good, some year might be bad, when it comes to housing benefit spending for the UK as a whole, because of economic shocks that affect the whole country. This is taken into account. What this is showing here is the amount that the Department for Works and Pension is spending or saving for the average district that had that experienced about a 400 pound kind of cut, where households experienced about a 400 pound cut. And you see that this kind of decline led to a decline in spending of about 2%, 2 percentage point of housing benefit spending. For London, for the London district, which had a much higher thing, the curve would be much lower, which means sort of the delta to the red line would be much bigger, roughly about 12 to 16%. This is what happens to possession orders and to actual repossessions over time. At the end of the day, it looked like stuff was actually improving relative to the years before the reform. We usually try to start things around 2008 because this is when local housing allowance was introduced in the incarnation that was reformed in 2011. There's a dramatic increase in possession orders. There's a dramatic increase in actual repossession. One of the reasons why economists tend to show this is because it tells you that these places did not see significantly higher levels of repossessions prior to the reform hitting. So it kind of is a type of falsification test that one can do. There is some, there's kind of some up and down, but it's not super systematic. This is the private sector eviction. This is the thing that we actually particularly study. This is where the reform hit, and this is where the most notable spikes are. The social rental sector is basically flat. So people living in the social rental sector were completely sheltered. I think one other group that was sheltered from this cut, or much less exposed to this cut, was non-working age housing benefit claimants. But I usually, basically all the austerity reforms hit the working age population, not the pensioners. In the paper, you'll find some tables that look like this. I just want to tell you what to interpret if you care to look at the paper. And again, as I said, we can cut things anytime. Feel free to intervene. What this is saying is that this is the average effect for a 1 standard deviation higher exposure to the reform. And we have different reform exposure measures. One that's based only on the statistical noise. That's the residualized part, which is kind of presented here in columns 5 or 6 vis-a-vis. And then there's something that's called a matched panel, but that's a bit more sophisticated. We actually really try to look at districts that are very comparable, that have basically the same number of benefit claims to begin with. So the stock of people is the same, but the shock is different based on the amount, the rent cut that was implied by the benefit cut. So so that we try to construct very similar counterfactuals, and that allows us to create comparisons between. There's a district in London that can be very well compared to to a place around Oxford, because they have similar waiting list waiting list length for social rented housing. They have similar levels of private sector rent prior to the thing. They have similar kind of levels of benefit claimants at baseline. So we're kind of holding the quantity fixed. We want to solely focus on the price variation at some level. So these coefficients tell you effect of 1 standard deviation higher shock measure. And if you want to get the percentage figures that I was quoting on some figures and pictures at the beginning, you basically just have to divide this by the mean of the dependent variable prior to the cut. And most of the dependent variables, they're all just measuring the number of eviction orders divided by the number of households resident in a district. And again, we're trying to make our life difficult to find effect because the denominator is moving as well. Because most districts have seen population growth, there are more households being added to districts. So we're always in this horse race between numerator versus denominator. The results are not dramatically different if we keep the denominator fixed. Because you would maybe worry that the denominator is also endogenously reacting to the numerator changing. That people don't want to live in a place that has seen lots of people being evicted, for example. Partly because we document there's an increase in crisis. So this is how the graphs look for individual insolvency cases. The rise in temporary accommodation. Actually, we've seen an improvement. There's a decline in the places that were most exposed to the reform. So the places that are most vulnerable to the reform, they actually have been improving, but kind of that takes a sharp turn post-reform. Council spending on hostels and B&Bs as one type of temporary accommodation that's typically provided at immediate. It was not existent prior to 2010, but it just was a completely dramatically smaller level, and this is why it's super flat. There's no difference. The impact of statutory homelessness, again, we see this almost immediately in the year in the year following the cut. People are being sort of evicted, and you can link the evictions to straight econometrically to an increase in statutory homelessness. Rough sleeping. This is, as you see, the standard errors here are very wide. The data is very noisy. Because it's not reliable. I spoke to the guys that are making this data. They know that it's not reliable. It's reliable for trends, but it's not reliable when it comes to levels. And this is yes, yes,
so that we can get some,
yes. Just on the fiscal neutrality, this is how it looks across maps. So this is the places where the Department for Works and Pension save most money. As London is there. We have some parts in the northwest and northeast. Most cities, this is where the Department for Works and Pensions saved most on housing benefit. But you will also see that this is where the spending increase on housing homeless people is highest. And this is how this looks across a graph. And this is where the statistic is coming from. So every dot here is a district, and it tells us, on average, how much less the central government is spending on housing benefit per 1,000 residents in this district, per 1,000 households in this district. So that's kind of the tax base, so to say. This is how much the residents would have to compensate in order to, this is how much you would have to pay them to keep, to prevent this. And this is how much the increase for council spending on homeless spending in this district is. You see this kind of straight line, which suggests that basically we're looking at the same beast. Okay. So what the analysis suggests is that housing benefit reforms mostly backfired, saving little to no money, but producing large indirect fiscal costs, but also huge social costs, because obviously evicting somebody is not cost-free for the state. It requires state resources to kind of conduct bailiffs and whatnot. So it's not cost-free. It's very redistributive, very regressive. It mostly hit working-age adults. There is this whole question about how this changes the way that communities are made up. The segmentation of people. I mean, it's something about creating offline echo chambers. We have this in the US, in Chicago, most pronounced. You cross the street and then you feel like you're in a different country. But this is, reforms like this kind of enable this type of spatial segmentation of housing markets and thereby by society. And in that sense, it's very, very problematic. Obviously, just throwing more money into the system won't solve the fact that the underlying problem is the inelastic housing supply in this country. And a lot of this has nothing to do with, has to do with, market power. At the end of the day, it's a very non-competitive industry. And I think this is at the heart, should be at the heart of, deep reform. Looking at what other countries are doing, how they're approaching it. This is in the US, you have huge variation across cities as to whether they have a housing problem or they do not have a housing problem. It's a political choice. At some level, thereby, it needs smart ideas that can break the gridlock of interests that prevent reform, because that's at the end of the day what it is. So I'll just stop here and leave it for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Theo. We've got a few minutes for questions. I wonder if I could just kick off by you've given some really interesting figures about the savings per pound there. But do you know what were the figures, like how much was the total amount the government expected to save from this, and how many did?
Yes. I actually, from this, they actually ended up saving more than they expected. So if we use our estimates, I mean, like this is literally what we end up. One of the main exercises that we do is we use the official impact assessments that they've conducted at the time, and we compare this with the estimated net outlays, and we actually see that the central government saved much more.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
The local government.
That's the key, right?
Yeah.
Use the mic.
Sorry.
So the central government ended up saving more than they expected. Part of this gets a bit fuzzy because as we move beyond 2013, other things happened that kind of compound the savings, which is, I skipped this. The change from the way that they didn't compute monthly rates anymore. They did it once a year using data from the past year. Obviously, this mechanically downward bias is the amount that the local housing allowance, the extent to which local housing allowance is representative of markets. And then in 2013, they shifted 2013-2014 financial year. They shifted towards not uprating that at all anymore. They still construct the 30th percentile, but they end up just uprating by CPI or freezing it, actually. Yeah.
I was going to say that freeze must have affected all your
Yes.
calculations as well, right?
I mean, the freeze is nice because it just amplifies. It does not, the freeze, because it's done based on a national price index. Yes, sorry. There was a freeze and there was an uprating as well. And the uprating part, that was done via the CPI for some years. And then the freeze started in 2015, I think.
Right.
So there was a period when there was an uprating that was based on CPI, which kind of, it doesn't kind of skew things around. From 2015 onwards, it's the local rental market evolution that really kicks in. Yeah.
Hi. Oh yeah. Can't hear. I'm a councillor in Hackney, and just to me, it is the absolute hidden scandal in this country. Like, people have no idea. Like, we're in just one borough of London, 3,000 families are in temporary accommodation or homeless. So that means like families turning up with cases at the council at 4:00, and they have to find places that those families will stay in that evening. And then that's found, and families will stay in one bedroom for a family for years. Yeah. This is like 3, 4, 5 years in temporary accommodation, which is one room for a family. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. But what I was going to highlight, which you just brought out, is this was very successful for central government. The central government department got what they wanted, right? They reduced their budget, and yet the catastrophic impact on council budgets, it's incredible. Yeah. And I think the thing that I kind of struggle with, you can tell, because it really, when you know about it, you're just like, oh, what do we do about this? But the thing I struggle with is, as you said, the link then to the political, because people don't see that. They only see the visible homelessness, and that is what people talk about. Yes. But that's not what people vote on. Yes. When they look at, I vote for whatever party, yeah, it makes a difference to how they think about things, but they're going to vote on their own stuff, right? And then if someone's going to do something about homelessness, maybe that's a good thing. And that, to me, is I guess, my challenge, my question.
Yeah, that was super interesting, thank you. I guess a couple of thoughts I have around the financial position. So the one thing you haven't mentioned was why DWP made that change in the first place, which was that they felt that landlords were holding them to hostage and that they were driving rents up and up. And so that policy, yes, it was about the financial savings, obviously, but it was about a gamble that DWP were making about the response that landlords would have. And I'd be interested in whether or not any of that played out. But what actually I think has then happened So you see local councils then having to pay more. A lot of that money is coming to them directly from central government to pay for it. So through things like 100 million into rough sleeping, but also through other routes in terms of discretionary housing payments and other ways that central government is having to go out to local areas because of the ridiculous cost that this is kind of brought to bear on them. And I guess, so for me, this is a massive example of where central government just doesn't have a particular grip on how one decision it makes massively plays through and affects like decisions and experience of people elsewhere. I completely agree with you, Anna Joy, that the huge cost and like it is a financial cost, but it's a deep human cost that you don't see. The biggest place that cost comes to bear is on individuals and on families. But my question really is like, if you were to go back, if you were to undo the freeze, which is in discussion in government at the moment, if you were to undo that freeze, would you get to a place where the cost in terms of homelessness and rough sleeping would be reduced? Because I'm not necessarily convinced that you would. And so it's like, although we see one single policy with a detrimental effect, is it enough to simply undo that policy?
No, because the policy itself is just responding to a failure, the bigger failure, right? And the bigger failure is that the inelastic housing supply that gives property owners so much market power. There's actually a good study by some economists at the IFS that have looked at this reform, and they've gotten the data from the DWP at the individual level. Oh, here we go. That's you. Sorry. We've been.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yes.
It's your paper.
So yeah, essentially we found that there was no impact on rents whatsoever. Both for people who were taking out new tenancies and for people who were simply affected by the policy. I think there's only for those who might have credibly been able to look for other accommodations, such as people in who would have been moved onto the shared room rate, and for people in very large properties.
Yes,
but essentially,
the big ones.
Yeah,
small,
yeah.
So. And that means that the incidence of the cut was fully on the tenants. It was not shared, and that's I think the social policy element to that. I mean, it's a great analysis. As I said, we emailed right before. I emailed your co-author.
Oh,
yes. About how they ended up getting access to the data, because I would love to get access to that data. The UK is great in many things, like research access much better than, let's say, in Germany. Germany, it's compounded by the fact that we have a federal system and it's very decentral and so on and so forth. That's great to come up with creative solutions to problems like this, but it comes at a cost to transparency for researchers. Okay.
Very, very quickly,
Yes.
I guess I'm just picking up on the same
Yeah.
points as everybody else, but how do you make these hidden costs visible on a national scale when you're deciding to make austerity cuts? So this is more of a macroeconomics questions in terms of fiscal rules and fiscal measurements. How do you bring them back in at the point of the next crisis when you decide to have austerity cuts? I don't know if there is an answer to that, but that's what I'm
That's a bit tricky. I mean, I think the overarching problem is the lack of a proper political settlement. It's just a zero-sum game between different branches of government. Part of that is formalized by the lack of a constitutional settlement that kind of formalizes the rules and responsibilities for different things. And I think that's, at the end of the day, at the heart. And this is why it's always just, you're just shifting the cost of the ultimate problem, which is the failure, the inelastic housing, but you're just shifting this back and forth. And this is, I mean, in this churn, a lot of lives get lost at the end of the day, and at some level, this is what's shocking, that this country has not been able to kind of break that gridlock for the last 20 years, and I don't think it will in the foreseeable future. I mean, who knows, right? But the structure of power is the same way. Those who vote for Party X, majority homeowners, they're benefiting from the system as it stands, but the intergenerational legitimacy and sort of the intergenerational equity of the system. I mean, this will become, year after year, become more and more burning, more and more burning issue. But I think at the end of the day, it's a problem it's an institutional failure. It's something that we would expect to see in a developing country, not in the UK.
I was just going to say, you shared a couple of examples of where this is similar in other parts of the world, so the US and Brussels at the moment. Where would you say has like a best case in terms of the way they have maybe reformed housing policy? I know you've been referring to Germany a lot.
Just because I know it more.
Yeah. I wondered if there was any other countries or regions where you see that they have done housing reform and it's worked for the people.
I mean, there's some interesting proposals here. I mean, from the party in the opposition here about taxing the wealth that gets generated through the land appreciation upon, granting planning permission. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the share of land costs in housing is crazy in this country. And at some level, it's a monopoly that's wielded by the state to grant planning permission. It should use, the government has the tools in hand. And this is where my hometown, I mean, in Germany it's done at the city level. Munich is a disaster, but my hometown Ulm, which is between Stuttgart and Munich, is great. They're monopolizing these rents. They're completely skimming these rents. That also has problems, because it means, so my family used to be farmers, and they had some land, but at the end of the day, nobody's ever willing to sell the land, because they would always get the bad rate, because you would have to sell it as agricultural land, and all the windfall profits are kind of absorbed by the state. So at some level, they have a problem of housing supply as well, because the quality of the housing that then ends up getting built after somebody ends up selling, because farmers do go bust and whatnot, they have to sell out. So land becomes available, but it becomes available at a very slow rate. So, but I think this is part of the problem, and also part of the solution of the can be part of the solution of building higher quality homes, because this country is doesn't have a great housing standards. I guess it's the only country in the Western world where the average home size has shrunk in the last 30 years. I mean, I don't advocate everybody should live in massive homes, but at some level it does tell you that there's a directional kind of development that goes in one way. So I think that, looking at these types of solutions, I think this is one particular element to it that might be interesting.
Is there any last question from anybody before we wrap up? Nope. I've got a list of them here. I guess it's just a kind of one that links to your previous thing about austerity generally. This kind of disengagement from the political engagement and things like that. Is that something that you've found there's a link with austerity more broadly as well? Because the other paper doesn't quite touch on that. But is that the same mechanism that's at play, or is it?
No, it's different. It's different in the following sense, that actually studying this type of reform in the way that I studied in the austerity paper is very difficult, because this is a reform that predominantly much more hit urban centers.
Right.
So, and that we know that urban parts are systematically different in many ways from more rural parts in this country. And just in terms of the tools of how this can be studied, the big problem here is that actually the underlying data that I use for the austerity paper, the individual level panel data, has a huge problem. Because guess who's most likely to disappear from the panel? It's people who live in private rented sector. So systematically, it's very difficult to study social policy issues using this data, which is government sponsored. It's part of the backbone of policy making or policy evaluation in this country, or that's the ambition for it to become this. It's very difficult for it to maintain the representativeness for the type of groups that would be affected by this group policy much more. The bedroom tax that I studied in that paper was great, because the vast majority of people did not move, and if they moved, they actually stayed in the panel. Yeah. But actually, there's huge attrition, and this is actually something to add. There's excess attrition by individuals who had their cut. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they move out of their district. They just move into a different part within their council. Yeah. That's the average type of mobility I would expect. But obviously, accounting for migration, internal migration, is something that we still need to do as well, because obviously some people do actually end up exiting. I think the perverse thing here was that the housing benefit cut, again, if I remember this correctly, it predominantly hit working age adult people, not pensioners. So you see excess out-migration of young people, and the people who kind of, not necessarily live productive lives in London, where the jobs are, they actually stayed. So it further exacerbates kind of the inequalities here. But that's also kind of a further angle to kind of look at. So But yeah, I mean, how to raise this to the level that people become aware, I don't know. I mean, the tweet thing, this went quite, almost half as viral as the austerity paper. So I think that was some good news. And despite this having, you know, it a bit scattered, it had a bit my own political views scattered in the way that I was writing it up, which in hindsight I shouldn't have. But, you know, I think, you know, at some level, you know, we're all political agents. So.
Half a Fetzer as a measure of viral tweetage is an interesting concept. Thiemo, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and I think you've really done a great job to shine a light on a kind of major policy change that the effects of which have been somewhat ignored, I think, in the political debate so far. So we'll leave it there, but thank you very much, and we look forward to your next paper and hearing about that. So let's thank Thiemo in the usual way.